The Dragon and the Raven by G. A. Henty. Chapter 4. The Invasion of Wessex. Edmund and Egbert devoted most of their time to the building of the new fort, living very simply, and expended the whole of the revenues of the lands on the payment of the freemen and masons engaged upon the work. The Roman fort was a parallelogram, the sides being about 200 yards long, and the ends half that length. It was surrounded by 2 earthen banks with wide ditches. They were deepened considerably, and the slopes were cut down more sharply. The inner bank was widened until it was 15 feet across the top. On this the wall was built. It was faced on both sides with square stones, the space between filled up with rubble and cement, the total thickness being 4 feet. The height of the wall was 8 feet, and at intervals of 30 yards apart towers were raised 10 feet above it, one of these being placed at either side of the entrance. Here the bank was cut away, and solid buttresses of masonry supported the high gates. The opening in the outer bank was not opposite to the gate in the inner, being 50 yards away, so that any who entered by it would have for that distance to follow the ditch between the 2 banks, exposed to the missiles of those on the wall before arriving at the inner gate. 500 men labored incessantly at the work. The stone for the walls was fortunately found close at hand, but notwithstanding this, the work took nearly 6 months to execute. Deep wells were sunk in the center of the fort, and by this means an ample supply of water was secured, however large might be the number within it. A very short time after the commencement of the work, the news arrived that King Edmund of East Anglia had gathered his forces together and had met the Danes in a great battle near Thetford on Sunday the 20th of November, and had been totally defeated by them, Edmund himself having been taken prisoner. The captive king, after having been for a long time cruelly tortured by the Danes, was shot to death with arrows. It was not long after this that news came that the whole of East Anglia had fallen into the hands of the Danes. Early in the month of February, 871, just as the walls of his fort had begun to rise, a messenger arrived from the king, bidding Edmund assemble all the men in his earlship and march at once to join him near Devizes, as the news had come that a great Danish fleet had sailed up the Thames and had already captured the royal town of Reading. Messengers were sent out in all directions, and early the next morning, 400 men having assembled, Edmund and his kinsmen marched away with them toward Devizes. Upon their arrival at that town they found the king and his brother with 8,000 men, and the following day the army moved east toward Reading. They had not marched many miles before a messenger arrived, saying that 2 of the Danish jarls with a great following had gone out to plunder the country, that they had been encountered by Ethelwulf, Earl of Berkshire, with his men at Englefield, and a fierce battle had taken place. The Saxons had gained the victory, and great numbers of the Danes had been slain, Sidroc, one of their jarls, being among the fallen. 3 days later the royal army arrived in sight of Reading, being joined on their march by Ethelwulf and his men. The Danes had thrown up a great rampart between the Thames and the Kennet, and many were still at work on this fortification. These were speedily slain by the Saxons, but their success was a short one. The main body of the Danish invaders swarmed out from the city, and a desperate engagement took place. The Saxons fought valiantly, led by the king and Prince Alfred, but, being wholly undisciplined and unaccustomed to war, they were unable to withstand the onslaught of the Danes, who fought in better order, keeping together in ranks. After 4 hours' hard fighting, the Saxons were compelled to fall back. They rallied again a few miles from Reading. Ethelred and Alfred went among them, bidding them be of good cheer, for that another time, when they fought in better order, they would gain the victory, and that their loss had not been greater than the Danes, only that unhappily the valiant ealdorman Ethelwulf had been slain. Fresh messengers were sent throughout the country, bidding all the men of Wessex to rally round their king, and on the 4th morning after the defeat Ethelred found himself at the head of a larger force than had fought with him in the last battle. The Danes had moved out from Reading and had taken post at Ashdown, and as the Saxon army approached they were seen to be divided into 2 bodies, one of which was commanded by their 2 kings and the other by 2 jarls. The Saxons therefore made a similar division of their army, the king commanding one division and Prince Alfred the other. Edmund with the men of Sherborne was in the division of Alfred. The Danes advanced to the attack and fell with fury upon them. It had been arranged that this division should not advance to the attack until that commanded by the king was also put in motion. For some time Alfred and his men supported the assaults of the Danes, and then, being hardly pressed, the prince sent a message to his brother to urge that a movement should be made. The Saxons were impatient at standing on the defensive, and Alfred saw that he must either allow them to charge the enemy or must retreat. Presently the messenger returned, saying that the king was in his tent hearing mass, and that he had given orders that no man should move or any should disturb him until mass was concluded. Alfred hesitated no longer. He formed his men into a solid body, and then, raising his battle cry, rushed upon the Danes. The battle was a furious one. The Danes were upon higher ground, their standard being planted by the side of a single thorn tree which grew on the slopes of the hill. Towards this Alfred with his men fought their way. The lesson of the previous battle had not been lost. The Saxons kept together in a solid body, which made its way with irresistible weight through the ranks of the Danes. Still, the latter closed in on all sides, and the fight was doubtful until the king, having finished his devotions, led his division into the battle. For a long time a desperate strife continued, and great numbers on both sides were killed, but the Saxons, animated at once by love of their country and hatred of the invaders, and by humiliation at their previous defeat, fought with such fury that the Danes began to give way. Then the Saxons pressed them still more hotly, and the invaders presently lost heart and fled in confusion, pursued in all directions by the exulting Saxons. The Danish king, Bergskeg, and 5 jarls, the 2 Sidrocs, Osbern, Fearn, and Harold, were slain, and many thousands of their followers. Great spoil of arms and armour fell into the hands of the victors. Edmund had fought bravely in the battle at the head of his men. Egbert had kept beside him, and twice, when the lad had been smitten to his knees by the enemy, covered him with his shield and beat off the foe. "You are over young for such a fight as this, Edmund," he said when the Danes had taken to flight. "You'll need another 4 or 5 years over your head before you can stand in battle against these fierce Northmen. They break down your guard by sheer weight, but you bore yourself gallantly, and I doubt not will yet be as famous a warrior as was your brave father." Edmund did not join in the pursuit, being too much bruised and exhausted to do so, but Egbert, with the men of Sherborne, followed the flying Danes until nightfall. "You have done well, my young ealdorman," Prince Alfred said to the lad after the battle. "I have been wishing much that you could be with me during the past month, but I heard that you were building a strong fort, and deemed it better to let you continue your work undisturbed. When it's finished I trust that I shall have you often near me, for I fear that for a time we shall have but little space for peaceful pursuits. For the Danes are coming, as I hear, in great troops westward, and we shall have many battles to fight ere we clear the land of them." In those days a defeat, however severe, had not the same decisive effect as it has in modern warfare. There were no cannons to lose, no great stores to fall into the hands of the victors. The army was simply dispersed, and its component parts reassembled in the course of a day or two, ready, when reinforcements arrived, to renew the fight. Thus decisive as was the victory of Ashdown, Prince Alfred saw that many such victories must be won, and a prolonged and exhausting struggle carried on, before the tide of invasion would be finally hurled back from Wessex. The next few days were spent in making a fair distribution of the spoil and arms among the conquerors. Some of the thanes then returned home with their people, but the remainder, on the king's entreaty, agreed to march with him against the Danes, who after the battle had fallen back to Basing, where they had been joined by others coming from the coast. The royal army advanced against them, and 14 days after the battle of Ashdown the struggle was renewed. The fight lasted for many hours, but towards nightfall the Saxons were compelled to retreat, moving off the field, however, in good order, so that no spoil fell into the hands of the Danes. The check was a great disappointment to the Saxons, who after their late victory had hoped that they should speedily clear the kingdom of the Danes. These indeed taught prudence by the manner in which the West Saxons had fought, for a while refrained from plundering excursions. 2 months later the Saxons were again called to arms. Somerled, a Danish chieftain, had again advanced to Reading, and had captured and burned the town. The king marched against him, and the 2 armies met at Merton. Here again another desperate battle took place. During the first part of the day the Saxons were victorious over both the divisions of the Danish army, but in the afternoon the latter received some reinforcements and renewed the fight. The Saxons, believing that the victory had been won, had fallen into disorder and were finally driven from the field. Great numbers were slain on both sides. Bishop Edmund and many Saxon nobles were killed, and King Ethelred so severely wounded that he expired a few days later. April 23rd, 1871, having reigned for 5 years. He was buried at Wimborne Minster, and Prince Alfred ascended the throne. Ethelred was much regretted by his people, but the accession of Alfred increased their hopes of battling successfully against the Danes. Although wise and brave, King Ethelred had been scarcely the monarch for a warlike people in troubled times. Religious exercises occupied too large a share of his thoughts. His rule was kindly rather than strong, and his authority was but weak over his nobles. From Prince Alfred the Saxons hoped better things. From his boyhood he had been regarded with special interest and affection by the people, as his father had led them to regard him as their future king. The fact that he had been personally consecrated by the Pope appeared to invest him with a special authority. His immense superiority in learning over all his people greatly impressed them. Though gentle, he was firm and resolute, prompt in action, daring in the field. Thus, then, although the people regretted King Ethelred, there was a general feeling of hope and joy when Alfred took his place on the throne. He had succeeded to the crown but a month when the Danes again advanced in great numbers. The want of success which had attended them in the last 2 battles had damped the spirit of the people, and it was with a very small force only that Alfred was able to advance against them. The armies met near Wilton, where the Danes in vastly superior numbers were posted on a hill. King Alfred led his forces forward and fell upon the Danes, and so bravely did the Saxons fight that for some time the day went favourably for them. Gradually the Danes were driven from their post of vantage, and after some hours' fighting turned to fly, but, as at Merton and Kesteven, the impetuosity of the Saxons proved their ruin. Breaking their compact ranks, they scattered in pursuit of the Danes, and these, seeing how small was the number of their pursuers, rallied and turned upon them, and the Saxons were driven from the field which they had so bravely won. "Unless my brave Saxons learn order and discipline," the king said to Edmund and some of his nobles who gathered round him on the evening after the defeat, "our cause is assuredly lost. We have proved now in each battle that we are superior man to man to the Danes, but we throw away the fruits of victories by our impetuosity. The great Caesar, who wrote an account of his battles which I have read in Latin, described the order and discipline with which the Roman troops fought. They were always in heavy masses, and even after a battle the heavy-armed soldiers kept their ranks, and did not scatter in pursuit of the enemy, leaving this task to the more lightly armed troops. Would that we had 3 or 4 years before us to teach our men discipline and order, but, alas, there is no time for this. The Danes have fallen in great numbers in every fight, but they are ever receiving reinforcements, and come on in fresh waves of invasion, while the Saxons, finding that all their efforts and valour seem to avail them nothing, are beginning fast to lose heart. See how small a number assembled round my standard yesterday, and yet the war is but beginning. Truly, the lookout is bad for England." The king made strenuous efforts again to raise an army, but the people did not respond to his call. In addition to the battles which have been spoken of, several others had been fought in different parts of Wessex by the ealdormen and their followers against bodies of invading Danes. In the space of 1 year the Saxons had engaged in 8 pitched battles and in many skirmishes. Great numbers had been slain on both sides, but the Danes ever received fresh accessions of strength, and seemed to grow stronger and more numerous after every battle, while the Saxons were dwindling rapidly. Wide tracts of country had been devastated, the men slaughtered, and the women and children taken captives, and the people, utterly dispirited and depressed, no longer listened to the voices of their leaders, and refused again to peril their lives in a strife which seemed hopeless. Alfred therefore called his ealdormen together, and proposed to them that since the people would no longer fight, the sole means that remained to escape destruction was to offer to buy off the Danes. The proposal was agreed to, for although none of them had any hope that the Danes would long keep any treaty they might make, yet even a little respite might give heart and spirit to the Saxons again. Accordingly negotiations were entered into with the Danes, and these, in consideration of a large money payment, agreed to retire from Wessex. The money was paid, the Danes retired from Reading, which they had used as their headquarters, and marched to London. King Burhard, the feeble king of Mercia, could do nothing to oppose them, and he too agreed to pay them a large annual tribute. From the end of 872 till the autumn of 875 the country was comparatively quiet. Alfred ruled it wisely, and tried to repair the terrible damages the war had made. Edmund looked after his earldom, and grew into a powerful young man of 19 years old. King Alfred had not deceived himself for a moment as to the future. The Danes, he said, are still in England. East Anglia and Northumbria swarm with them. Had this army, after being bought off by us and my brother of Mercia, sailed across the seas and landed in France, there would have been some hope for us, but their restless nature will not allow them to stay long in the parts which they have conquered. In Anglia, King Guthrum has divided the land among his jarls, and there they seem disposed to settle down, but elsewhere they care not for the land, preferring to leave it in the hands of its former owners to till, and after to wring them from the cultivators the fruits of the harvest. Then, as the country becomes thoroughly impoverished, they must move elsewhere. Mercia they can overrun whensoever they choose, and after that there is nothing for them to do but to sweep down again upon Wessex. And with all the rest of England at their feet, it's hopeless to think that we alone can withstand their united power." "Then what, think you, must be at the end of this?" Edmund asked. "'Tis difficult to see the end," Alfred replied. "It would seem that our only hope of release from them is that when they have utterly eaten up and ravaged England they may turn their thoughts elsewhere. Already they are harrowing the northern coasts of France, but there are richer prizes on the Mediterranean shores, and it may be that when England is no longer worth plundering they may sail away to Spain and Italy. We have acted foolishly in the way we have fought them. When they first began to arrive upon our coasts we should have laboured hard to build great fleets, so that we could go forth and meet them on the seas. Some indeed might have escaped our watch and landed, but the fleets would have cut off reinforcements coming to them, and thus those who reached our shores could have been overwhelmed. Even now I think that something might be done that way, and I propose to build a fleet which may, when they again invade us, take its station near the mouth of the Thames and fall upon the vessels bringing stores and reinforcements. This would give much encouragement to the people, whose hopelessness and desperation are caused principally by the fact that it seems to be of no use killing the enemy, since so many are ready constantly to take their places." "I will gladly undertake to build one ship," Edmund said. "The fort is now finished, and with the revenues of the land I could at once commence a ship, and if the Danes give us time, when she is finished I would build another. I will the more gladly do it, since it seems to me that if the Danes entirely overrun our country we must take to the sea, and so in turn become plunderers. With this view I will have the ship built large and strong, so that she may keep the sea in all weathers, and be my home if I am driven out of England. There must be plenty of ports in France, and many a quiet nook and inlet round England, where one can put in to refit when necessary, and we could pick up many a prize of Danish ships returning laden with booty. With such a ship I could carry a strong crew, and with my trusty Egbert and the best of my fighting men we should be able to hold our own, even if attacked by 2 or 3 of the Danish galleys." "The idea is a good one, Edmund," the king said, "and I would that I myself could carry it into effect. It were 1,000 times better to live a free life on the sea, even if certain at last to be overpowered by a Danish fleet, than to lurk a hunted fugitive in the woods. But I cannot do it. So long as I live I must remain among my people, ready to snatch any chance that may offer of striking a blow against the invader. But for you it's different." "I should not, of course, do it," Edmund said, "until all is lost here, and mean to defend my fort to an extremity. Still, should it be that the Danes conquer all our lands, it were well to have such a refuge." Edmund talked the matter over with Egbert, who warmly entered into the plan. "So long as I have life I will fight against the Danes, and in a ship at least we can fight manfully till the end. We must not build her on the sea coast, or before the time when we need her she may be destroyed by the Danes. We will build her on the Parrot. The water is deep enough far up from the sea to float her when empty, and if we choose some spot where the river runs among woods we might hide her, so that she may to the last escape the attention of the Danes. We must get some men crafty in shipbuilding from one of the ports, sending down a body of our own serfs to do the rough work. We'll go to Exeter first, and there choose us the craftsman most skilled in building ships, and will take counsel with him as to the best form and size. She must be good to sail, and yet able to row fast with a strong crew, and she must have room to house a goodly number of rowing and fighting men. You, Edmund, might, before we start, consult King Alfred. He must have seen at Rome and other parts on the Mediterranean the ships in use there, which are doubtless far in advance of our own. For we know from the Holy Bible that 1,000 years ago St. Paul made long voyages in ships, and doubtless they have learned much since those days." Edmund thought the idea a good one, and asked the king to make him a drawing of the vessels in use in the Mediterranean. This King Alfred readily did, and Egbert and Edmund then journeyed to Exeter, where, finding out the man most noted for his skill in building ships, they told him the object they had in view, and showed him the drawings the king had made. There were two of them, the one a long galley rowed with double banks of oars, the other a heavy trading ship. "This would be useless to you," the shipwright said, laying the second drawing aside. "It would not be fast enough either to overtake or to fly. The other galley would, methinks, suit you well. I've seen a drawing of such a ship before. It's a war galley such as used by the Genoese in their fights against the African pirates. They are fast and roomy, and have plenty of accommodation for the crews. One of them, well manned and handled, should be a match for 6 at least of the Danish galleys, which are much lower in the water and smaller in all ways. But it will cost a good deal of money to build such a ship." "I will devote all the revenues of my land to it until it is finished," Edmund said. "I will place 100 serfs at your service, and will leave it to you to hire as many craftsmen as may be needed. I intend to build her in a quiet place in a deep wood on the river Parrot, so that she may escape the eyes of the Danes." "I shall require seasoned timber," the shipwright urged. "That will I buy," Edmund replied, "as you shall direct, and can have it brought up the river to the spot." "Being so large and heavy," the shipwright said, "she will be difficult to launch. Methinks it were best to dig a hole or a dock at some distance from the river. Then when she is finished a way can be cut to the river wide enough for her to pass out. When the water is turned in it will float her up level to the surface, and as she will not draw more than 2 feet of water, the cut need not be more than 3 feet deep." "That will be the best plan by far," Edmund agreed, "for you can make the hole so deep that you can build her entirely below the level of the ground. Then we can, if need be, fill up the hole altogether with bushes and cover her up, so that she would not be seen by a Danish galley rowing up the river, or even by any of the enemy who might enter the wood, unless they make special search for her, and there she could lie until I chose to embark." The shipwright at once set to work to draw out his plans, and a week later sent to Edmund a messenger with an account of the quantity and size of wood he should require. This was purchased at once. Edmund and Egbert with their serfs journeyed to the spot they had chosen, and were met there by the shipwright, who brought with him 20 craftsmen from Exeter. The wood was brought up the river, and while the craftsmen began to cut it up into fitting sizes, the serfs applied themselves to dig the deep dock in which the vessel was to be built. Chapter 5: A Disciplined Band. The construction of the ship went on steadily. King Alfred, who was himself building several war vessels of ordinary size, took great interest in Edmund's craft, and paid several visits to it while it was in progress. "It will be a fine ship," he said one day as the vessel was approaching completion, "and much larger than any in this seas. It reminds me, Edmund, not indeed in size or shape, but in its purpose, of the ark which Noah built before the deluge which covered the whole earth. He built it, as you know, to escape with his family from destruction. You too are building against the time when the deluge of Danish invasion will sweep over this land, and I trust that your success will equal that of the patriarch." "I shall be better off than Noah was," Edmund said, "for he had nothing to do save to shut up his windows and wait till the floods abated, while I shall go out and seek my enemies on the sea." The respite purchased by the king from the Danes was but a short one. In the autumn of 875 their bands were again swarming around the borders of Wessex, and constant eruptions took place. Edmund received a summons to gather his tenants, but he found that these no longer replied willingly to the call. Several of his chief men met him and represented to him the general feeling which prevailed. "The men say," their spokesman explained, "that it is useless to fight against the Danes. In 872 there were 10 pitched battles, and vast numbers of the Danes were slain, and vast numbers also of the Saxons. The Danes are already far more numerous than before, for fresh hordes continue to arrive on the shores, and more than fill up the places of those who are killed. But the places of the Saxons are empty, and our fighting force is far smaller than it was last year. If we again go out and again fight many battles, even if we are victorious, which we can hardly hope to be, the same thing will happen, Many thousands will be slain, and the following year we shall in vain try to put an army in the field which can match that of the Danes, who will again have filled up their ranks, and be as numerous as ever. So long as we continue to fight, so long the Danes will slay, burn, and destroy wheresoever they march, until there will remain of us but a few fugitives hidden in the woods. We should be far better off did we cease to resist, and the Danes become our masters, as they have become the masters of Northumbria, Mercia, and Anglia. There, it is true, they have plundered the churches and thanes' houses, and have stolen all that is worth carrying away, but when they have taken all that there is to take, they leave the people alone and unmolested to till the ground and to gain their livelihood. They do not slay for the pleasure of slaying, and grievous as it is the condition of the Angles, they and their wives and children are free from massacre, and are allowed to gain their livings. The West Saxons have shown that they are no cowards. They have defeated the Northmen over and over again when far outnumbering them. It's no dishonour to yield now, when all the rest of England has yielded, and when further fighting will only bring ruin upon ourselves, our wives, and our children." Edmund could find no reply to this argument. He knew that even the king despaired of ultimately resisting the Danish invasion, and after listening to all that the thanes had to say, he retired with Egbert apart. "What say you, Egbert? There is reason in the arguments that they use. You and I have neither wives nor children, and we risk only our own lives, but we can well understand that those who have so much to lose are chary of further effort. What say you?" "I do not think it will be fair to press them further," Egbert answered, "but methinks that we might raise a band consisting of all the youths and unmarried men in the earldom. These we might train carefully and keep always together, seeing that the lands will still be cultivated and all able to pay their assessment, and may even add to it, since you exempt them from service. Such a band we could train and practise until we could rely upon them to defeat a far larger force of the enemy, and they would be available for our crew when we take to the ship." "I think the idea is a very good one, Egbert. We will propose it to the thanes." The proposition was accordingly made that all married men should be exempt from service, but that the youths above the age of 16 and the unmarried men should be formed into a band and kept permanently under arms. Landowners who lost the services of sons or freemen working for them should pay the same assessment only as before, but those who did not contribute men to the levy should pay an additional assessment. Edmund said he would pay the men composing the band the same wages they would earn in the field, and would undertake all their expenses. "So long as the king continues the struggle," Edmund said, "it is our duty to aid him, nor can we escape from the dangers and perils of invasion. Should the Danes come near us, all must perforce fight, but so long as they continue at a distance things can go on here as if we had peace in the land." The proposal was, after some discussion, agreed to, and the news caused gladness and contentment throughout the earldom. The younger men who had been included in the levy were quite satisfied with the arrangement. The spirit of the West Saxons was still high, and those without wives and families who would suffer by their absence or be ruined by their death were eager to continue the contest. The proposal that they should be paid as when at work was considered perfectly satisfactory. The men of Sherborne had, under their young leader, gained great credit by their steadiness and valour in the battles 4 years before, and they looked forward to fresh victories over the invader. The result was that 90 young men assembled for service. Edmund had sent off a messenger to the king saying that the people were utterly weary of war and refused to take up arms, but that he was gathering a band of young men with whom he would ere long join him. But he prayed for a short delay in order that he might get them into a condition to be useful on the day of battle. After consultation with Egbert, Edmund drew up a series of orders somewhat resembling those of modern drill. King Alfred had once, in speaking to him, described the manner in which the Thebans, a people of northern Greece, had fought, placing their troops in the form of a wedge. The formation he now taught his men. From morning to night they were practised at rallying from pursuit or flight, or changing from a line into the form of a wedge. Each man had his appointed place both in the line and wedge. Those who formed the outside line of this formation were armed with large shields, which covered them from chin to foot, and with short spears. Those in the inner lines carried no shields, but bore spears of increasing length, so that 4 lines of spears projected from the wedge to nearly the same distance. Inside the 4 lines were 20 men armed with shields, bows, and arrows.
The sides of the wedge were of equal length, so that they could march either way. Egbert's place was at the apex of the wedge, intended generally for attack. He carried no spear, nor did those at the other corners, as they would be covered by those beside and behind him. He was armed with a huge battle axe. The other leaders were also chosen for great personal strength. Edmund's place was on horseback in the middle of the wedge, whence he could overlook the whole and direct their movements. In 3 weeks the men could perform their simple movements to perfection, and at a sound from Edmund's horn would run in as when scattered in pursuit or flight, or could form from line into the wedge without the least confusion, every man occupying his assigned place. The men were delighted with their new exercises, and felt confident that the weight of the solid mass, thickly bristling with spears, would break through the Danish line without difficulty, or could draw off from the field in perfect order and safety in case of a defeat, however numerous their foes. The 2 front lines were to thrust with their pikes, the other keeping their long spears immovable to form a solid hedge. Each man carried a short heavy sword to use in case, by any fatality, the wedge should get broken up. When assured that his band was perfect in their new exercise, Edmund marched and joined the king. He found on his arrival that the summons to arms had been everywhere disregarded. Many men had indeed come in, but these were in no way sufficient to form a force that would enable him to take the field against the Danes. Edmund therefore solicited and obtained permission to march with his band to endeavour to check the plundering bands of Danes, who were already committing devastations throughout the country. "Be not rash, Edmund," the monarch said. "You have but a handful of men, and I should grieve indeed did aught of harm befall you. If you can fall upon small parties of plunderers and destroy them, you will do good service, not only by compelling them to keep together, but by raising the spirits of the Saxons. But avoid conflict with parties likely to defeat you." "You shall hear of us soon, I promise you," Edmund replied, "and I trust that the news will be good." The little party set out towards the border, and before long met numbers of fugitives weeping, women carrying children, old men and boys making their way from the neighbourhood of the Danes. The men had for the most part driven their herds into the woods, where they were prepared to defend them as best they could against roving parties. They learned that Haffa, a Danish jarl with about 600 followers, was plundering and ravaging the country about 12 miles away. The force was a formidable one, but after consultation with Egbert, Edmund determined to advance, deeming that he might find the Danes scattered and cut off some of their parties. As they neared the country of which the Danes were in possession, the smoke of burning villages and homesteads was seen rising heavily in the air. Edmund halted for the night in a wood about a mile distant from a blazing farm, and the band lay down for some hours. Before daybreak 3 or 4 of the swiftest footed of the men were sent out to reconnoitre. They learned from badly wounded men whom they found lying near the burning farms that the Danes had been plundering in parties of 20 or 30, but that the main body under Haffa lay 5 miles away at the village of Bristow. A consultation was held, and it was agreed that the party should remain hidden in the wood during the day, and that upon the following night they should fall upon the Danes, trusting to the surprise to inflict much damage upon them, and to be able to draw off before the enemy could recover sufficiently to rally and attack them. Accordingly, about 9 o'clock in the evening they started and marched rapidly, approaching Bristow an hour and a half later. They could see great fires blazing, and round them the Danes were carousing after their forays of the day. Great numbers of cattle were penned up near the village. Edmund and Egbert, having halted their men, stole forward until close to the village in order to learn the nature of the ground and the position of the Danes. Upon their return they waited until the fires burned low and the sound of shouting and singing decreased. It was useless to wait longer, for they knew that many of the Danes would, according to their custom, keep up their revelry all night. Crawling along the ground, the band made for the great pen, where were herded the cattle which the Danes had driven in from the surrounding country, and over which several guards had been placed. Before starting, Egbert assigned to each man the special duties which he was to fulfil. The Saxons crept up quite close to the Danish guards, unobserved. To each of these 3 or 4 bowmen had been told off, and they, on nearing the sentries, lay prone on the ground with bows bent and arrows fixed, until a whistle from Edmund gave the signal. Then the arrows were loosed, and the distance being so short the Danish sentries were all slain. Then a party of men removed the side of the pen facing the village. The rest mingled with the cattle, and soon, with the points of their spears, goaded them into flight. In a mass the herd thundered down upon the village, the Saxons keeping closely behind them and adding to their terror by goading the hindermost. The Danes, astonished at the sudden thunder of hoofs bearing down upon them, leaped to their feet and endeavoured to turn the course of the herd, which they deemed to have accidentally broken loose, by loud shouts and by rattling their swords against their shields. The oxen, however, were too terrified by those in their rear to check their course, and charged impetuously down upon the Danes. Numbers of these were hurled to the ground and trampled under foot, and the wildest confusion reigned in the camp. This was increased when, as the herds swept along, a number of active men with spear and sword fell suddenly upon the Danes. Scores were cut down or run through before they could prepare for defence, or recover from their surprise at the novel method of attack. At last, as the thunder of the herd died away in the distance, and they became aware of the comparative fewness of their foes, they began to rally and make head against their assailants. No sooner was this the case than the note of a horn was heard, and as if by magic their assailants instantly darted away into the night, leaving the superstitious Danes in some doubt whether the whole attack upon them had not been of a supernatural nature. Long before they recovered themselves and were ready for pursuit, the Saxons were far away, no less than 200 of the Danes having been slain or trampled to death, while of Edmund's band not one had received so much as a wound. The Saxons regained the wood in the highest state of exultation at their success, and more confident than before in themselves and their leader. "I am convinced," Edmund said, "that this is the true way to fight the Danes, to harry and attack them by night assaults until they dare not break up into parties, and become so worn out by constant alarms that they will be glad to leave a country where plunder and booty are only to be earned at so great a cost." Knowing that Haffa's band would for some time be thoroughly on the alert, Edmund moved his party to another portion of the country, where he inflicted a blow almost as heavy as he had dealt Haffa upon Sigbert, another of the Danish jarls. 3 or 4 more very successful night attacks were made, and then the Danes, by this time thoroughly alarmed, obtained from some Saxon country people whom they took prisoners news as to the strength of Edmund's band. Furious at the heavy losses which had been inflicted upon them by so small a number, they determined to unite in crushing them. By threats of instant death and by the offers of a high reward, they succeeded in persuading 2 Saxon prisoners to act as spies, and one day these brought in to Haffa the news that the band had that morning, after striking a successful blow at the Danes 10 miles away, entered at daybreak a wood but 3 miles from his camp. The Northman, disdaining to ask for assistance from one of the other bands against so small a foe, moved out at once with 300 of his men towards the wood. The Saxons had posted guards, who on the approach of the Danes roused Edmund with the news that the enemy were close at hand. The Saxons were soon on their feet. "Now, my friends," Edmund said to them, "here is the time for trying that benefit we have got from our exercise. We cannot well draw off, for the Danes are as fleet-footed as we, therefore let us fight and conquer them." The men formed up cheerfully, and the little body moved out from the wood to meet the Danes. The latter gave a shout of triumph as they saw them. The Saxon force, from its compact formation, appeared even smaller than it was, and the Norsemen advanced in haste, each eager to be the first to fall upon an enemy whom they regarded as an easy prey. As they arrived upon the spot, however, and saw the thick hedge of spears which bristled round the little body of Saxons, the first comers checked their speed, and waited till Haffa himself came up, accompanied by his principal warriors. Without a moment's hesitation the jarl flung himself upon the Saxons. In vain, however, he tried to reach them with his long sword. As he neared them, the front line of the Saxons dropped on one knee, and as the Danes with their shields dashed against the spears and strove to cut through them, the kneeling men were able with their pikes to thrust at the unguarded portions of the bodies below their shields, and many Danes fell grievously wounded. After trying for some time in vain, Haffa, finding that individual effort did not suffice to break through the Saxon spears, formed his men up in line 4 deep, and advanced in a solid body so as to overwhelm them. The Saxons now rose to their feet. The spears, instead of being pointed outwards, were inclined toward the front, and the wedge advanced against the Danes. The Saxon war cry rose loud as they neared the Danish line, and then, Still maintaining their close formation, they charged upon it. The assault was irresistible. The whole weight was thrown upon a point, and preceded as it was by the densely packed spears, it thrust through the Danish line as if the latter had been composed of osier twigs, bearing down all in its way. With shouts of surprise the Danes broke up their line and closed in a thick mass round the Saxons, those behind pressing forward and impeding the motions of the warriors actually engaged. The Saxons no longer kept stationary. In obedience to Edmund's orders the triangle advanced, sometimes with one angle in front, sometimes with another, but whichever way it moved, sweeping away the Danes opposed to it, while the archers from the centre shot fast and strong into the mass of the enemy. Haffa himself, trying to oppose the advance of the wedge, was slain by a blow of Egbert's axe, and after half an hour's fierce fighting, the Danes, having lost upwards of 50 of their best men, and finding all their efforts to produce an impression upon the Saxons vain, desisted from the attack and fled. At once the wedge broke up, and the Saxons followed in hot pursuit, cutting down their flying enemies. Obedient, however, to Edmund's repeated shouts, they kept fairly together, and when the Danes, thinking them broken and disordered, turned to fall upon them, a single note of the horn brought them instantly together again, and the astonished Danes saw the phalanx which had proved so fatal to them prepared to receive their attack. This they did not attempt to deliver, but took to flight, the Saxons as before pursuing, and twice as many of the Danes were slain in the retreat as in the first attack. The pursuit was continued for many miles, and then, fearing that he might come across some fresh body of the enemy, Edmund called off his men. Great was the triumph of the Saxons. A few of them had suffered from wounds more or less serious, but not one had fallen. They had defeated a body of Danes 4 times their own force, and had killed nearly half of them, and they felt confident that the tactics which they had adopted could enable them in future to defeat any scattered bodies of Danes they might meet. For a week after the battle they rested, spending their time in further improving themselves in their drill, practising especially the alterations of the position of the spears, requisite when changing from a defensive attitude, with the pikes at right angles to each face, to that of an attack, when the spears of both faces of the advancing wedge were all directed forward. A messenger arrived from the king, to whom Edmund had sent the news of his various successes, and Alfred sent his warmest congratulations and thanks for the great results which had been gained with so small a force, the king confessing that he was unable to understand how, with such disproportionate numbers, Edmund could so totally have routed the force of so distinguished a leader as Haffa. For some weeks Edmund continued the work of checking the depredations of the Danes, and so successful was he that the freebooters became seized with a superstitious awe of his band. The rapidity of its manoeuvring, the manner in which men at one moment scattered were in another formed in a serried mass, against which all their efforts broke as waves against a rock, seemed to them to be something superhuman. In that part of Wessex, therefore, the invaders gradually withdrew their forces across the frontier, but in other parts of the country, the tide of invasion being unchecked, large tracts of country had been devastated, and the West Saxons could nowhere make head against them. One day a messenger reached Edmund telling him that a large Danish army was approaching Sherborne, and urging him to return instantly to the defence of his earldom. With rapid marches he proceeded thither, and on arriving at his house he found that the Danes were but a few miles away, and that the whole country was in a state of panic. He at once sent off messengers in all directions, bidding the people hasten with their wives and families, their herds and valuables, to the fort. His return to some extent restored confidence. The news of the victories he had gained over the Danes had reached Sherborne, and the confidence of their power to defeat the invaders which his followers expressed as they scattered to their respective farms again raised the courage of the people. All through the night bands of fugitives poured into the fort, and by morning the whole of the people for many miles round were assembled there. Egbert and Edmund busied themselves in assigning to each his duty and station. All the men capable of bearing arms were told off to posts on the walls. The old men and young boys were to draw water and look after the cattle, the women to cook and attend to the wounded. The men of his own band were not placed upon the walls, but were held in readiness as a reserve to move to any point which might be threatened, and to take part in sorties against the enemy. Soon smoke was seen rising up in many directions, showing that the enemy were at their accustomed work. Cries broke from the women, and exclamations of rage from the men, as they recognized by the direction of the smoke that their own homesteads and villages were in the hands of the spoilers. About midday a party of mounted Danes rode up towards the fort and made a circuit of it. When they had satisfied themselves as to the formidable nature of its defences they rode off again, and for the rest of the day none of the enemy approached the fort. Chapter 6: The Saxon Fort. A strict watch was kept all night, and several scouts were sent out. These, on their return, reported that the Danes were feasting, having slain many cattle and broached the casks of mead which they found in the cellars of Edmund's house. This they had not burned, nor the houses round it, intending, as the scouts supposed, to make it their headquarters while they attacked the fort. Edmund and Egbert agreed that it would be well to show the Danes at once that they had an active and enterprising foe to deal with. They therefore awakened their band, who were sleeping on skins close to the gate, and with them started out. It was still 2 hours before dawn when they approached the house. Save a few men on watch, the great Danish host, which the messengers calculated to amount to 10,000 men, were asleep, cautiously making their way so as to avoid stumbling over the Danes, who lay scattered in groups round the house. The Saxons crept forward quietly until close to the entrance, when a sleepy watchman started up. "Who are ye?" The answer was a blow from Egbert's battle axe. Then the leaders with 20 of their men rushed into the house, while the rest remained on guard at the entrance. The combat was short but furious, and the clashing of arms and shouts of the Danes roused those sleeping near, and the men who escaped from the house spread the alarm. The fighting lasted but 3 or 4 minutes, for the Danes, scattered through the house, and in many cases still stupid from the effects of the previous night's debauch, were unable to gather and make any collective resistance. The two jarls fought in a manner worthy of their renown, but the Saxon spears proved more than a match for their swords, and they died fighting bravely till the last. Between Saxon and Dane there was no thought of quarter. None asked for mercy on either side, for none would be granted. The sea rovers never spared an armed man who fell into their hands, and the Saxons were infuriated by the sufferings which the invaders had inflicted upon them, and had no more pity upon their foes than they had with wild animals. Besides the jarls, some 30 of their minor leaders were in the house, and but 5 or 6 of them escaped. It was well for the Danes that the detachment which lay there was not their principal body, which was still a few miles in the rear, for had it been so 2 of their kings and 6 jarls, all men of famed valour, would have been slain. The instant the work was done the Saxons rejoined those assembled at the entrance. Already the Danes were thronging up, but at present in confusion and disorder, coming rather to see what was the matter than to fight, and hardly believing that the Saxons could have had the audacity to attack them. In an instant the Saxons fell into their usual formation, and overturning and cutting down those who happened to be in their path, burst through the straggling Danes, and at a trot proceeded across the country. It was still dark, and it was some time before the Danes became thoroughly aware of what had happened. Then, missing the voices of their leaders, some of them rushed into the house, and the news that the 2 jarls and their companions had been slain roused the Danes to fury. At once they set off in pursuit of the Saxons in a tumultuous throng, but the band had already a considerable start, and had the advantage of knowing every foot of the country, of which the Danes were ignorant. When once fairly through the enemy, Edmund had given the word, and the formation had broken up, so that each man could run freely and without jostling his comrades. Thus they were enabled to proceed at a rapid pace, and reached the fort just as day was breaking, without having been discovered or overtaken by the Danes. The news of this successful exploit raised the spirit of the garrison of the fort. The Danes swarmed nearly up to the walls, but seeing how formidable was the position, and being without leaders, they fell back without making an attack, some of the more impetuous having fallen from the arrows of the bowmen. About midday a solid mass of the enemy were seen approaching, and the banners with the black raven on a blood-red field showed that it contained leaders of importance, and was in fact the main body of the Danes. It was an imposing sight as it marched towards the fort, with the fluttering banners, the sun shining upon the brass helmets and shields of the chiefs, and the spearheads and swords of the footmen. Here and there parties of horsemen galloped about the plain. "Their number has not been exaggerated," Egbert said to Edmund. "There must be 10,000 of them. They are fully twice as many as attacked us on the field of Kesteven." The sight of the great array struck terror into the minds of a great part of the defenders of the fort, but the confident bearing of their young ealdorman and the thought of the strength of their walls reassured them. The Danes halted at a distance of about a quarter of a mile from the walls, and 3 or 4 of their chiefs rode forward. These, by the splendour of their helmets, shields, and trappings, were clearly men of great importance. They halted just out of bowshot distance, and one of them, raising his voice, shouted, "Dogs of Saxons, have ye laid down your arms and made submission to me, I would have spared you. But for the deed which you did last night, and the slaying of my brave jarls, I swear that I will have revenge upon you, and by the god Woden, I vow that not one within your walls, man, woman, or child, shall be spared. This is the oath of King Uffa." "It were well, King Uffa," Edmund shouted back, "to take no rash oaths. Before you talk of slaying you have got to capture, and you will need all the aid of your false gods before you take this fort. As to mercy, we should as soon ask it of wolves. We have God and our good swords to protect us, and we fear not your host, were it 3 times as strong as it is." The Saxons raised a great shout, and the Danish king rode back to his troops. The lesson which had been given them of the enterprise of the Saxons was not lost, for the Danes at once began to form a camp, raising an earthen bank which they crowned with stakes and bushes as a defence against sudden attacks. This work occupied them for 2 days, and during this time no blow was struck on either side, as the Danes posted a strong body of men each night to prevent the Saxons from sallying out. On the 3rd day the work was finished, and the Danish kings with their jarls made a circuit round the walls, evidently to select the place for attack. The time had passed quietly in the fort. In one corner the priests had erected an altar, and here mass was said 3 times a day. The priests went among the soldiers, exhorting them to resist to the last, confessing them and giving them absolution. The pains which the Danes had taken in the preparation of their camp was a proof of their determination to capture the fort, however long the operation might be. It showed, too, that they recognized the difficulty of the task, for had they believed that the capture could be easily effected, they would at once upon their arrival have advanced to the attack. "Tomorrow morning early," Egbert said, "I expect that they will assault us. In the first place, probably they will endeavour to carry the fort by a general attack. If they fail in this, they will set to construct engines with which to batter the wall." At daybreak the following morning the Danes issued from their camp. Having formed up in regular order, they advanced towards the castle. They divided into 4 bands. 3 of these wheeled round to opposite sides of the fort. The 4th, which was as large as the other 3 together, advanced towards the entrance. The Saxons all took the posts previously assigned to them on the walls. Edmund strengthened the force on the side where the gate was by posting there in addition the whole of his band. Although there were nearly 350 fighting men within the walls, of whom the greater part had fought against the Danes in the battles of the previous year. The attack commenced simultaneously on all sides by a discharge of arrows by the archers of both parties. The Saxons, sheltered behind the parapet on the walls, suffered but slightly, but their missiles did considerable execution among the masses of the Danes. These, however, did not pause to continue the conflict at a distance, but uttering their battle cry, rushed forward. Edmund and Egbert had but little fear of the attack on the other faces of the fort proving successful. The chief assault was against the gate, and it was here that the real danger existed. The main body of the Danes covered themselves with their shields and rushed forward with the greatest determination, pouring through the gap in the outer bank in a solid mass, and then turning along the fosse towards the inner gate. Closely packed together, with their shields above their heads, forming a sort of testudo or roof which protected them against the Saxons' arrows, they pressed forward in spite of the shower of missiles with which the Saxons on the walls assailed them. Arrows, darts, and great stones were showered down upon them, the latter breaking down the shields and affording the archers an opportunity of pouring in their arrows. Numbers fell, but the column swept along until it gained the gate. Here those in front began an attack upon the massive beams with their axes, and when they had somewhat weakened it, battered it with heavy beams of timber until it was completely splintered. While this was going on, the Saxons had continued to shoot without intermission, and the Danish dead were heaped thickly around the gate. The Danish archers, assisted by their comrades, had scrambled up onto the outer bank and kept up a heavy fire on the defenders of the wall. The Saxons sheltered their heads and shoulders, which were above the parapet, with their shields, and between these, as through loopholes, their archers shot at the Danes. Edmund and Egbert had debated much on the previous days whether they would pile stones behind the gate, but had finally agreed not to do so. They argued that although for a time the stones would impede the progress of the Danes, these would, if they shattered the door, sooner or later pull down the stones or climb over them, and it was better to have a smooth and level place for defence inside. They had, however, raised a bank of earth 10 feet high in a semicircle at a distance of 20 yards within the gate. When it was seen that the gates were yielding, Edmund had called down his own band from the walls and formed them in a half circle 10 yards from the gate. They were 4 deep, as in their usual formation, with the 4 lines of spears projecting toward the gate. The mound behind them he lined with archers. At last the gates fell, and with an exulting shout the Danes poured in. As they did so, the archers on the mound loosed their arrows, and the head of the Danish column melted like snow before the blast of a furnace. Still they poured in and flung themselves upon the spearmen, but they strove in vain to pierce the hedge of steel. Desperately they threw themselves upon the pike heads and died there bravely, but they were powerless to break a passage. The archers on the mound still shot fast among them, while those on the wall, turning around, smote them in the back, where, unprotected by their shields, they offered a sure and fatal mark. Soon the narrow semicircle inside the gate became heaped high with dead, impeding the efforts of those still pressing in. Several of the bravest of the Danish leaders had fallen. The crowd in the fosse, unaware of the obstacle which prevented the advance of the head of the column, and harassed by the missiles from above, grew impatient, and after half an hour of desperate efforts, and having lost upwards of 300 of his best men, the Danish king, Uffa, furious with rage and disappointment, called off his men. On the other 3 sides the attack equally failed. The Danes suffered heavily while climbing the steep side of the inner mound. They brought with them faggots, which they cast down at the foot of the wall, but this was built so near the edge of the slope that they were unable to pile sufficient faggots to give them the height required for a successful assault upon it. Many climbed up on their comrades' shoulders, and so tried to scale the wall, but they were thrust down by the Saxon spears as they raised themselves to its level, and in no place succeeded in gaining a footing. Over 200 fell in the 3 minor attacks. There were great rejoicings among the Saxons, at whose side but 23 had been killed. A solemn mass was held, at which all save a few lookouts on the walls attended, and thanks returned to God for the repulse of the pagans. Then the garrison, full of confidence, awaited the next attack of the enemy. Stones were piled up in the gateway to prevent any sudden surprise being effected there. The Danes in their retreat had carried off their dead, and the next morning the Saxons saw that they were busy with the ceremonies of their burial. At some little distance from their camp the dead were placed in a sitting position, in long rows, back to back, with their weapons by their sides, and earth was piled over them until a great mound 50 yards long and 10 feet high was raised. 3 jarls and one of their kings were buried separately. They were placed together in a sitting position, with their helmets on their heads, their shields on their arms, and their swords by their sides. Their 4 war horses were killed and laid beside them. 20 slaves were slaughtered and placed lying round them for their spirits to attend them in the Valhalla of the gods. Golden drinking vessels and other ornaments were placed by them, and then a mound 40 feet in diameter and 20 feet high was piled over the whole. The whole force were occupied all day with this work. The next day numbers of trees were felled and brought to the camp, and for the next 2 days the Danes were occupied in the manufacture of war engines for battering down the walls. Edmund and Egbert utilized the time in instructing the soldiers who did not form part of the regular band in the formation of the quadruple line of defence which the Danes had found it so impossible to break through, so that if more than one breach was effected, a resistance similar to that made at the gate could be offered at all points. The skins of the oxen killed for the use of the garrison were carefully laid aside, the inside being thickly rubbed with grease. The Danish preparations were at length completed. The war engines were brought up and began to hurl great stones against the wall at 3 points. The Saxons kept up a constant fire of arrows at those employed at working them, but the Danes, though losing many men, threw up breastworks to protect them. The Saxons manufactured many broad ladders, and in the middle of the night, lowering these over the walls, they descended noiselessly, and 3 strong bodies fell upon the Danes guarding the engines. These fought stoutly, but were driven back, the engines were destroyed, and the Saxons retired to their walls again and drew up their ladders before the main body of Danes could arrive from the camp. This caused a delay of some days in the siege, but fresh engines having been constructed, the assault on the walls was recommenced, this time the whole Danish army moving out and sleeping at night close to the engines. After 3 days of battering, breaches of from 30 to 50 feet wide were effected in the walls. The Saxons had not been idle. Behind each of the threatened points they raised banks of earth 10 feet high, and cut away the bank perpendicularly behind the shattered wall, so that the assailants, as they poured in at the gaps, would have to leap 10 feet down. Each night the masses of wall which fell inside were cleared away, and when the breach was complete, and it was evident that the assault would take place the next morning, the hides which had been prepared were laid with the hairy side down on the ground below. Through them they drove firmly into the ground numbers of pikes, with the heads sticking up 1 or 2 feet, and pointed stakes hardened in the fire. Then, satisfied that all had been done, the Saxons lay down to rest. In the morning the Danes advanced to the assault. This time they were but little annoyed in their advance by the archers. They were posted on the walls at each side of the gaps to shoot down at the backs of the Danes after they had entered. On the inner semicircular mounds the Saxon force gathered 4 deep. With loud shouts the Danes rushed forward, climbed the outer mounds, and reached the breaches. Here the leaders paused on seeing the gulf below them, but pressed by those behind they could not hesitate long, but leapt down from the breach onto the slippery hides below. No one who did so lived. It was impossible to keep their feet as they alighted, and as they fell they were impaled by the pikes and stakes. Pressed by those behind, however, fresh men leapt down, falling in their turn, until at length the hides and stakes were covered, and those leaping down found a foothold on the bodies of the fallen. Then they crowded on, and strove to climb the inner bank and attack the Saxons. Now the archers on the walls opened fire upon them, and, pierced through and through with the arrows which struck them on the back, the Danes fell in great numbers. Edmund commanded at one of the breaches, Egbert at another, and Oswald, an old and experienced warrior, at the third. At each point the scene was similar. The Danes struggled up the mounds only to fail to break through the hedge of spears which crowned them, vast numbers dying in the attempt, while as many more fell pierced with arrows. For an hour the Danes continued their desperate efforts, and not until 1,500 had been slain did they draw off to their camp, finding it impossible to break through the Saxon defences. Loud rose the shouts of the triumphant Saxons as the Danes retired, and it needed all the efforts of their leaders to prevent them from pouring out in pursuit. But the events of the preceding year had taught the Saxon leaders how often their impetuosity after success had proved fatal to the Saxons, and that once in the plain the Danes would turn upon them and crush them by their still greatly superior numbers. Therefore no one was allowed to sally out, and the discomfited Danes retired unmolested. The next morning, to their joy, the Saxons saw that the invaders had broken up their camp and had marched away in the night. Scouts were sent out in various directions, and the Saxons employed themselves in stripping and burying the Danes who had fallen within the fort, only a few of the most distinguished having been carried off. The scouts returned with news that the Danes had made no halt, but had departed entirely from that part of the country. Finding that for the present they were free of the invaders, the Saxons left the fort and scattered again, to rebuild as best they might their devastated homes. But if in the neighbourhood of Sherborne the Danes had been severely repulsed, in other parts of the kingdom they continued to make great progress, and the feeling of despair among the Saxons increased. Great numbers left their homes, and, taking with them all their portable possessions, made their way to the sea coast, and there embarked for France, where they hoped to be able to live peaceably and quietly. Edmund placed no hindrance in the way of such of his people who chose this course, but the prospect appeared well nigh hopeless. The majority of the Saxons were utterly broken in spirit, and a complete conquest of the kingdom by the Danes seemed inevitable. In the spring, however, of 877, King Alfred again issued an urgent summons. A great horde of Danes had landed at Exeter and taken possession of that town, and he determined to endeavour to crush them. He sent to Edmund begging him to proceed at once to Poole, where the king's fleet was ready for sea, and to embark in it with what force he could raise, and to sail and blockade the entrance to the river Exe, and so prevent the Danes from reinforcing their countrymen, while he with his forces laid siege at Exeter. Edmund would have taken his own vessel, but some time would have been lost, and the king's ships were short of hands. He was not sorry indeed that his men should have some practice at sea, and taking his own band, in which the vacancies which had been caused in the defence of the fort had been filled up, he proceeded to Poole. Here he embarked his men in one of the ships, and the fleet, comprising 20 vessels, put to sea. The management of the vessels and their sails was in the hands of experienced sailors, and Edmund's men had no duties to perform except to fight the enemy when they met them. The news of the siege of Exeter reached the Danes at Wareham, which was their headquarters, and 120 vessels filled with their troops sailed for the relief of Exeter. The weather was unpropitious. Heavy fogs lay on the water, dissipated occasionally by fierce outbursts of wind. The Saxon fleet kept the sea. It was well that for a time the Danish fleet did not appear in sight, for the Saxons, save the sailors, were unaccustomed to the water, and many suffered greatly from the rough motion, and had the Danes appeared for the first week after the fleet put to sea, a combat must have been avoided, as the troops were in no condition to fight. Presently, however, they recovered from their malady and became eager to meet the enemy. Edmund bade his men take part in the working of the ship, in order to accustom themselves to the duties of seamen. The fleet did not keep the sea all the time, returning often to the straits between the Isle of Wight and the mainland, where they lay in shelter, a lookout being kept from the top of the hills, whence a wide sweep of sea could be seen, and where piles of wood were collected by which a signal fire could warn the fleet to put to sea should the enemy's vessels come in sight. A full month passed, and the Saxons began to fear that the Danes might have eluded them, having perhaps been blown out to sea, and having made the land again far to the west. One morning, however, smoke was seen to rise from the beacon fire. The crews who were on shore instantly hurried on board. From the hills the Danish fleet was made out far to the west, and was seen to be approaching the land from seaward, having been driven far out of its course by the winds. The weather was wild and threatening, and the sailors predicted a great storm. Nevertheless the fleet put to sea, and with reefed sails ran to the west. Their vessels were larger than the Danish galleys, and could better keep the sea in a storm. Many miles were passed before from the decks the Danish flotilla could be seen. Presently, however, a great number of their galleys were discerned rowing in towards Swanage Bay. In spite of the increasing fury of the wind, the Saxons spread more sail and succeeded in intercepting the Danes. A desperate fight began, but the Danes in their low, long vessels had all they could do to keep afloat on the waves. Many were run down by the Saxons. The showers of arrows from their lofty poops confused the rowers and slew many. Sweeping along close to them, they often broke off the oars and disabled them. Sometimes 2 or 3 of the Danish galleys would try to close with a Saxon ship, but the sea was too rough for the boats to remain alongside while the men tried to climb up the high sides, and Saxons with their spears thrust down those who strove to do so. Confusion and terror soon reigned among the Danes, and fearing to try to escape by sea in such a storm, they made for the shore, hotly pursued by the Saxons. But the shore was even more inhospitable than their foes. Great rocks bordered the coast, and upon these the galleys were dashed into fragments. The people on shore, who had gathered at the sight of the approaching fleets, fell upon such of the Danes as succeeded in gaining the coast, and everyone who landed was instantly slain. Thus, partly from the effects of the Saxon fleet, but still more from that of the storm, the whole of the Danish fleet of 120 vessels was destroyed, not a single ship escaping the general destruction.